Hello, it's me again. I'm back to read more of this book too. How the Body Keeps the Score. I'm currently keeping the score with my buddy. Yeah, being an asshole. It's not being nice. Sitting here with castor oil on my tummy with the heat pad because I am having liver and colon issues. Colonic inertia, gastroparesis, vagal nerve dysfunction. That's all what it boils down to, friends, is vagus nerve dysfunction. Because just about everything in my life's dysfunctional. Anyway, I'm slowly making my way through this book, reading you, hoping that I make it through. Do you ever start a book and then have a really hard time finishing it? That's me every time, and that's why I'm reading it to you. So that way I feel like I'm accountable, because I'm like, it's been a week since I read my book to my people. My people. You're my people. Thanks for being my people. Let's get to it. I have an appointment and I need to leave in about 30 minutes to go see this frequency lady. I think that's what she does. It's another holistic healer, and I'm pretty sure she does Reiki and healing frequencies and stuff. Apparently I have parasites, and we're gonna deal with those parasites. So yeah, I think we were on diagnosing post-traumatic stress. In those early days at the VA, we labeled our veterans with all sorts of diagnoses. Alcoholism, substance abuse, depression, mood disorder, even schizophrenia. And we tried every treatment in our textbooks. But for all our efforts, it became clear that we were actually accomplishing very little. I feel this book was written quite some time ago, and he's talking about quite some time ago. And they're still just now barely making progress with some mental health. It's cool. Anyway. Accomplishing very little. The powerful drugs that we prescribed often left the men in such a fog that they could barely function. When we encouraged them to talk about the precise details of a traumatic event, we often inadvertently triggered a full-blown flashback rather than helping them resolve the issue. That's why I hate therapy. I talk about the most surface level shit with my therapist. I have not gone deep with my therapist because it's by the time I finally get it out, we're closing in on the end of the session, and then I don't get to finish. And then I'm just left for 2 weeks in the sludge. So yeah. Many of them dropped out of treatment because we were not only failing to help, but also sometimes making things worse. A turning point arrived in 1980 when a group of Vietnam veterans, aided by New York psychoanalysts, James Shatton and Robert J. Lifton, successfully lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to create a new diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which described a cluster of symptoms that was common to a greater or lesser extent to all of our veterans. Systematically identifying the symptoms and grouping them together into a disorder finally gave a name to the suffering of people who were overwhelmed by horror and helplessness. With the conceptual framework of PTSD in place, the stage was set for a radical change in our understanding of our patients. This eventually led to an explosion of research and attempts at finding effective treatments. Inspired by possibilities presented by this new diagnosis, I proposed a study on the biology of traumatic memories to the VA. Did the memories of those suffering from PTSD differ from those of others? For most people, the memory of an unpleasant event eventually fades or transforms into something more benign. But most of our patients were unable to make their past into a story that happened long ago. The opening line of The Great Rejection read, "It has never been shown that PTSD is relevant to the mission of the Veterans Administration." Since then, of course, the mission of the VA has become organized around the diagnosis of PTSD and brain injury, and considerable resources are dedicated to applying evidence-based treatments to traumatized war veterans. But at the time, things were different, and unwilling to keep working in an organization whose view of reality was so at odds with my own, I handed in my resignation. In 1982, I took a position at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center and the Harvard Teaching Hospital, where I had trained to become a psychiatrist. My new responsibility was to teach a fledgling area of study, psychopharmacology, the administration of drugs to alleviate mental illness. In my new job, I was confronted on almost a daily basis with issues I had thought I had left behind me at the VA. My experience with combat veterans had so sensitized me to the impact of trauma that I now listened with a very different ear. Not every different ear. He only had two. He has 2 ears. My experience with combat veterans had so sensitized me to the impact of trauma that I now listened with a very different ear when depressed and anxious patients told me stories of molestation and family violence. I was particularly struck by how many female patients spoke of being sexually abused as children. This was puzzling, as the standard textbook of psychiatry at the time stated that incest was extremely rare in the United States, occurring about once every million women. What? Right. Y'all live in a fantasy. Given that there were only about 100 million women living in the U.S., I wondered how 47, almost half of them, had found their way into my office in the basement of the hospital. Furthermore, the textbook said, there is little agreement about the role of father-daughter incest as a source of serious subsequent psychopathology. My patients with incest histories were hardly free of subsequent psychopathology. They were profoundly depressed, confused, and often engaged in bizarrely self-harmful behavior, such as cutting themselves with razor blades. The textbook went on to practically endorse incest, explaining that such incestuous activity diminishes the subject's chance of psychosis and allows for a better adjustment to the external world. In fact, as it turned out, incest had devastating effects on women's well-being. You think? In many ways, these patients were not so different from the veterans I had just left behind at the VA. They also had nightmares and flashbacks. They also alternated between occasional bouts of explosive rage and long periods of being emotionally shut down. Most of them had great difficulty getting along with other people and had trouble maintaining meaningful relationships. As we now know, war is not the only calamity that leaves human lives in ruins. While about a quarter of the soldiers who serve in our war zones are expected to develop serious post-traumatic problems, the majority of Americans experience a violent crime at some point during their lives. And more accurate reporting has revealed that 12 million women in the United States have been victims of rape. More than half of all rape occurs in girls below age 15. For many people, the war begins at home. Each year, about 3 million children in the United States are reported as victims of child abuse and neglect. 1 million of these cases are serious and credible enough to force local child protective services or the courts to take action. In other words, for every soldier who serves in a war zone abroad, there are 10 children who are endangered in their own homes. What? I'm going to read that again. In other words, for every soldier who serves in a war zone abroad, there are 10 children who are endangered in their own homes. This is particularly tragic, since it is a since it is very difficult for growing children to recover when the source of terror and pain is not the enemy combatants, but their own caretakers. In the 3 decades since I met Tom, we have learned an enormous amount, not only about the impact and manifestations of trauma, but also about ways to help traumatized people find their way back. Since the early 1990s, brain imaging tools have started to show us what actually happens inside the brains of traumatized people. I would love to look at what my brain does. I would really love to get a scan of this old noggin. I mean, I've had a lot of MRIs and MRAs and whatever that new MRI is that I did, and CT scans and all those things. I've had all those things, but I mean, like, I think it's a PET scan? Is that the one that's all colorful and, like, shows you what parts of your brain lights up when things happen? I need that. Where was I? This has proven essential to understanding the damage inflicted by trauma and has guided us to formulate entirely new avenues of repair. We've also begun to understand how overwhelming experiences affect our innermost sensations and our relationship to our physical reality, the core of who we are. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on our mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We have discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually it's not enough. The act of telling the story does not necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of the body that remains hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the processes by which it heals. Thank you for reading with me today. This one's a little bit short. I will be back sooner than a week, hopefully. I've been really, really ill. But I saw an herbalist yesterday. She gave me some stuff that is helping. And I'm going to go see this frequency chick here in a minute. She's going to help me. I'm going to get better every day. And I will come back with chapter 2. Bye. Have a good day.